Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Mosier's 8th grade U.S. History class. This is a video lecture looking at one of the aspects of the Cold War. Today we'll be focusing on the diplomatic approach, so stopping the spread of communism in the early years of the Cold War. The textbook reading today comes from Adjusting to Peace, pages 844 to 850. The guiding questions are: what was the Iron Curtain? How was Germany divided after World War II? What was NATO? What was the Warsaw Pact? What was the Truman Doctrine? What was the Marshall Plan? What was the policy of containment? How did this guide U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War? As we mentioned in our previous lecture, that there's beginning to be a fracturing taking place between these allies from World War II, the United States, Great Britain on one side, and the Soviet Union on the other side. There's a lot of mistrust between the two factions from the era of the World War II. As the Cold War is beginning, there just doesn't seem to be the same kind of trust now that the Hitler and the Nazis have been defeated. A speech given by Winston Churchill will give one in the United States in Missouri, where he states that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. All these populations lie in the Soviet sphere and are all subject not only to Soviet influence, but to increasing control from Moscow. And this speech lays rise to a phrase known as the Iron Curtain, which comes to describe the divisions that take place in Europe between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. This imaginary line that eventually will be occupied by actual fences and barriers and checkpoints will come to symbolize this division between Eastern Europe, which is under the control and influence of the Soviet Union and Moscow. They're not allowed to have free elections when the war is over. They're kind of become puppet states of the Soviet Union and directly under their influence and their control. And then in Western Europe, you have these democratic nations that are not under the control of the Soviet Union and communism, but are very scared and fearful that communism seems to be kind of on the march. So you see this political cartoon here. Here is the Iron Curtain. Again, not a real curtain, but a fictitious one that begins to separate here from the West, from the East, and we can't really tell what's going on behind the curtain. There are some mysteries taking place that we're a little worried about, the lack of democracy and freedom. And we can see here Winston Churchill is trying to peek underneath the curtain to see what kind of divisions are taking place there in Europe. So this becomes a symbolization of the Cold War, really in Europe, this division that takes place. And Germany becomes another part of that symbol of the Iron Curtain. You have here Germany being divided at the end of World War II. East Germany will be under the occupation and control of the Soviet Union under communism, and in the western part of Germany, those will be under the control of the Western Allies, the non-communist countries, the democratic countries like France, Great Britain, and the United States. And in the city of Berlin, the capital of Germany, will also be divided, East Berlin versus West Berlin. East Berlin will be under the control and occupation of the communists of the Soviet Union, and in West Berlin you have the French, you have the British, and the Americans kind of controlling those sectors of the city, and those will stay divided all through the Cold War. It will not be until the end of the Cold War in the 1990s where Berlin and Germany will reunify back as one whole country again. But during the Cold War, they are forever split and forever divided amongst the Soviets on one side and the Americans and our allies, the British, the French, on the other side. It's this division between communism and non-communism that begins to take shape. President Truman, in this fear of the spreading of communism, will introduce a new foreign policy called the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was to support any nation to stop the spread of communism, which was a worry taking place in Turkey and in Greece. At the end of World War II, both of these societies were kind of raging through a civil war. You had the communist backers on one side, you had the anti-communists on the other side trying to gain control of the country. And the United States says, we are going to step in on the side of democracy. So this becomes known as the Truman Doctrine and helps bring about this policy we're going to get to called containment. We don't want communism to spread. So America is really no longer going to play this isolationist role post-World War II. We are going to be more of this global cop. we're going to be actively involved in some of these international affairs that are taking place. Also, the Marshall Plan is also created at the end of World War II, a plan designed to help rebuild Europe, strengthen trade with the United States, strengthen democratic institution and movements in Western Europe. The worry is that Western Europe, which has been destroyed and ravaged by years of warfare, need to be rebuilt and rebuilt very quickly. And so the United States plan to spend $13 billion over the next 4 years in the rebuilding efforts inside of Europe. The idea is to counter influences of the Soviet Union. The worry is the Soviet Union is trying to expand its influence and spread communism throughout the world. And if Western Europe is in ravaged destruction, they are going to maybe succumb to the temptations of communism. That equality of resources might sound good if you're living in a bombed out building and there's no food. And so the worry there is the Marshall Plan is to stop that, to quickly get Europe back on its feet as a trading partner and kind of influence the spread of communism. Militarily, besides these financial foreign policy efforts like in the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan was giving money to allies to combat communism, we also formed military alliances as well. So we got NATO being created in the 1940s and 50s as a result to counterbalance the spread of communism. An attack on a NATO member is an attack on all of us. So it was a kind of act as a threatening zone from the Soviet Union saying, don't mess with our friends, don't mess with our allies. So this military alliance, which is made up of the United States and Canada and North America, hence the name North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and lots of the Western European countries will all join this alliance to try and protect them from they see as a perceived threat coming out of the Soviet Union. Not to be outdone, the Soviet Union will form their own alliance of the Eastern Bloc countries that are the communist nations that are under the control of the Soviet Union and their influence of the Soviet Union will form the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw is a city in Poland, which is where this was signed. It forms a military alliance among all the Eastern Bloc countries under the communist influences from this perceived threat of NATO. So what once were former allies, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union fighting together to defeat fascism in Germany and Italy, are now forming alliances against each other. There are concerns that these two sides are, this war could escalate and these two sides could maybe eventually go to war. So battle lines have been drawn, East versus West, East dominated by the Soviet Union, the West dominated by the United States, and here you have these superpowers forming alliances and forming sides and kind of drawing a line in the map saying this is where we are going to fight between the two sides. We're not going to let either side gain traction and an advantage on the other side. This becomes known as containment. We have to contain communism. Don't let communism spread. And that was the fear of Stalin, that he was, after taking these Eastern European countries and making them become communist nations, very worried from the West perspective that he was trying to spread communism from around the globe. So containment is this policy of keeping communism bottled up in where it already exists. Eastern Europe, you're under Soviet occupation, we can't help you, but we're going to not let you spread communism out to the West. So the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, something called the Berlin Airlift, the NATO alliance, all these are efforts to try and contain communism where it currently exists, not to let it spread out around the globe. That becomes the fear that drives the foreign policies throughout the Cold War. We are worried that the Soviet Union is trying to spread their tentacles of communism around the globe, and so we are going to stop it with containment. How do we do that? We form a military alliance with our allies of NATO, so that if they are threatened or attacked, we come to their defense. We have money spent in the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan to help out countries that are recovering from World War II, to prevent them from falling to communism and becoming a democratic ally of the United States. And that dominates the rest of our foreign policy, really throughout the rest of the Cold War, which is going to end up getting us involved in two major conflicts that we'll be learning about later, the war in Korea as well as the war in Vietnam, trying to stop the spread of communism. Containment, keep them contained, keep them bottled up. Thanks for listening. As always, if you have questions, please make sure you ask your teacher, and I'll see you next time.